I'll start with my kind of first overall role. I'm the program director for the Broadbent Institute. And the Broadbent Institute is a social democratic, nonprofit policy research and leadership training organization founded by Ed Broadbent about 8 years ago. Are any of you familiar with Ed Broadbent? Who in the room knows who Ed Broadbent is? Woo! Yay, Ed! Who is still, a force to be reckoned with. Let me tell you, I spent Saturday with him, and the man is continues to be a great thinker and a great leader that advises our work on a regular basis. So it's been really, really wonderful to be part of the Broadbent Institute, and we work on a lot of different issues. We work on inequality in all of its various forms, but definitely with a focus on economic inequality. We work on democratic renewal, which we certainly need in Canada these days. And we work on the idea of building a green economy where there's good, stable jobs for everyone. Those are our big baskets of areas we work, and there's a plethora of issues in each of those baskets. But ultimately, we work to win, because winning is important, right? Canadian values, because most Canadians, in fact, are progressive. And that's seen in poll after poll after poll, is what we're built to try to do. So today I'm going to talk to you about one particular project, and this is my other role at Broadbent. This project is Press Progress, and I'm the publisher of Press Progress. Now, who here has ever heard of Press Progress? Raise your hand. Heard of it? Not bad. Who here has ever read a story by Press Progress? All right, a few. And who here, this is the ultimate bar, it's a high standard, who here has shared a story of Press Progress? Okay, I got like 4. Now, hopefully by the end of this conversation, I'm going to convince many of you that we need more of this. We need you to share our content. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to explain why. So let me just start with telling you a little bit about what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk about how Press Progress was created in 2013 and why. What were the conditions then? So I'm going to take us back a little bit. We're going to do a little time traveling back there. I'm going to talk about the kinds of things that Press Progress covers as a news site. And then I'm going to talk about, and the impact it's had, the reason why we think this is meaningful work within the realm of digital news media. And then I'm going to talk about the landscape, the digital online social media landscape that we find ourselves in today, and the challenges that we're facing and some of the solutions that we see to that landscape. That landscape that very much today is kind of taken over largely by right-wing, extreme right content that we have to kind of battle on a daily basis. We're going to talk a bit about that. All right, does that sound good to everyone? Thumbs up. Okay, so imagine 2013. Take our minds back. In 2013, Stephen Harper was in his second majority government. 2 years into his second majority government, he had been in power for many years, and his neoconservative brand of narrative and politics had really taken hold in Canada. He was countered by, for the first time ever, an official opposition that was the NDP. Jack Layton's NDP. At this point had 100 and some odd seats for the first time ever in Canada, and was offering a counterpoint that we hadn't seen in a very, very long time. But that counterpoint wasn't getting a whole lot of coverage. Add into this the fact that news media organizations were reducing their staff. We're reducing their reporters, we're reducing their newsrooms by half in some cases. At this time, I was working sort of as a political advocate and strategist in the city of Toronto for various groups, and I saw both the Queen's Park newsroom there and the City of Toronto bureau there basically go to about a third of the reporters. At the same time, news coverage has changed incredibly. News coverage now started happening on a 24/7 basis. It used to be that editors and reporters had to worry about like 3 deadlines, right? You know, there was a morning deadline, there was a late afternoon deadline, and then there was a late evening filing deadline. That was it. Now, They're driven to file news stories every couple of hours and to break a story before their competitors do. And they're doing this with less staff. So what does this all mean? It means that Harper and the people that supported him, the organizations that supported him, like the Fraser Institute, like the Montreal Economic Institute and others, really had free rein to put forward a neoconservative narrative about Canada without a whole lot of scrutiny. Because the media wasn't there to scrutinize it, right? And we saw that really happening. We saw Harper's style of dismantling the progressive parts of the government was very, very strategic and very much under the cover. So things like, do some people remember what he did around canceling the mandatory long-form part of the census? He canceled that mandatory long-form part of the census because he knew that that collected the information that social progressive movements used to argue for social justice. That's where we found out, how bad low-income workers were doing. That's how we found out how bad racialized communities were doing. That's how we found out these things, and we had facts that were gathered from that information. And we would take it and use those facts to argue for good programs. Well, he canceled that, and he canceled it kind of under the cover of darkness. There was a little media coverage about it, but no one really understood it and didn't get brought. And he did that time and time again on different sorts of things. So we felt we really needed to put forward some sort of project, some sort of effort in order to counter the neoconservative narrative by fact-checking what Harper was putting forward and doing a proper analysis of it, ensuring that right-wing think tanks like the Fraser Institute didn't get away with research reports that they would put into the world that were filled with, just bad research about why, raising the minimum wage would destroy the economy, why private schools are better than public schools, why some two-tiered medicine would work for us. All those things are the types of things that Fraser Institute was pushing out, and they needed to be countered. But the other thing we needed to counter is we need to take on the political candidates in the Conservative Party. We needed to counter the right-wing think tanks, but we also needed to shine a light on the darker recesses of the conservative movement, where we were starting to see burgeoning and emboldened white supremacists, Islamophobists, just straight out bigots, and then more social conservative movements like anti-abortionists take greater hold. So that became the reason why we sort of existed, and we started, of course, with going after, in our minds, enemy number one. Now, you'll notice this is kind of a first set of pieces that we put out in 2013. We decided that for Christmas we would give people the present of Harper's 10 top fails. Now, Harper was a guy that didn't mind being taken to task on a lot of things, but he didn't like to be called a failure. So we went right at that, and you'll notice that the content is very, attractive, shareable, kind of tongue-in-cheek, maybe a little arch, maybe a little satirical. And the idea is, and the reason why we did this, was because we needed more than anything for a wide audience, not just our converted, but a wide audience to be attracted to it, to engage in it, and to share it with their friends. Because that's how the whole model was built. You had to be able to have the kind of content that people said, that's interesting. Okay, I'm going to share that. Or, yeah, that really pisses me off. Those hypocrites, and they share it. And that was what we built it on. There were a lot of news sites. There were a lot of information sites like Ricochet, like Rabble, who were doing a great job of producing some really great content, but to very limited audiences. We wanted to reach a wide, broad audience. So that's how we came across this. And quick word. Let me give you a sense of where we are now, which is, since we've launched in 2013, we have now four full-time staff, which is, to me, very impressive. I think people think we're a lot bigger than we are, but really we have 4 full-time staff. And we have 2 million readers in 2018 alone. So we have, a very broad appeal, I think. Over 145,000 people follow us now on Facebook, and our stories have been read by 1 in 4 Canadians since 2013. And what's interesting about us is that we have these kind of very clickable, some would call clickbait stories, but people actually go to our website and read them. We have tens of thousands of people every month who go to our website. On really big months where we've got a lot of content, 200,000 people go to our website and spend 2-3 minutes reading the story. We can see this in the stats. So people aren't just interested in seeing the headline, they actually do. We have an audience that actually wants to take in the information. And that's really great. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what we see as our role in a more in-depth way. We were sort of built to try to comment on elements of what was happening in our political and social spheres that weren't being covered in the mainstream media, right? Fact check what politicians are saying, what think tank groups are coming out with. We started to realize, though, that we also needed to be about breaking the news and doing our own research, and we needed to decide to take on what I would term as some big nasties. So the first big nasty that we decided to take on, one of the first big nasties that we decided to take on, was this guy, Ezra Levant, who is, well, he's rather infamous, and as many of you may know, he leads an alt-right media company called the Rebel Media. And before 2016, 2017, not many people knew about them, and then they kind of blew up. It became quite a big thing. And we decided we needed to do everything we could to expose what they were actually saying. Because what they were actually saying was horrible things. Their content was just riddled with everything from Holocaust denial to straight out almost neo-Nazi content. I mean, it was disgusting. It was actually, I feel for our reporters who would spend hours watching these videos and this content from this news site, and they would come out just depressed. It's really depressing work, but also resolute in their desire to expose it and to uncover it. And so we probably, wrote in that year, which was 2017, and in 2016, probably wrote dozens of stories about what we saw on Rebel Media. And some of those stories helped do a couple of things. They helped people realize that many of the characters around Rebel Media, characters like Faith Goldie, who some of you may have heard of as well, were saying things on Rebel Media that they weren't saying in other broader audiences that were really offensive. So it exposed a part of a facet of what they thought that they weren't willing to share in broader spaces, but were willing to share when they had this one audience. So we exposed that. Another one was Andrew Lawton. And because of that, Rebel Media actually ended up ending their relationship with some of those people because they decided it was even too toxic for them. Now, our continued battle to expose some of the things that Rebel Media does has actually put us at this point into a lawsuit with Rebel Media. So, sometimes things just keep on going. So years and years of dealing with Rebel Media. But it's important to note that we're not just out there to pick fights with people. We're also out there to shape the news because we think that the news needs to do a better job of scrutinizing these sorts of groups, but also scrutinizing the messages that are put forward by conservatives in general, and the right wing in general. Just to be clear, we never claim that we don't have a bias, by the way. We do claim to be a news site, and we are. We follow journalistic standards. We research our stories, we fact check them, we always call the people involved in our stories for comment. We do all the things that journalists do, but we are forthright in saying that we are doing this from a progressive lens. And we think that most conservative ideas that are put out there are bad ideas and are often filled with falsehoods that need to be fact-checked. So that's where we come from. And we don't apologize for that, and we don't deny it either. And I think that's important because I think a lot of news agencies, big news agencies, will claim to be unbiased and will in fact not be unbiased. And I think that's more dangerous. I think it's more dangerous to hide your bias from your viewership and from your audience than it is just to be forthright about it. What's wrong with that? We all have biases. Okay, so the next example I want to give is where we tried to shape the news. Now, many of you might have heard of something called Tax Freedom Day. Who's heard of Tax Freedom Day? Yeah? Fraser Institute's famous Tax Freedom Day? Every June, at some point in June, they would come out and they would declare with great alarm and frustration that at this point, people had made just enough money to pay their taxes. Halfway through the year, all of that money is going to the tax man. And wasn't this absolutely outrageous? And they had done this year after year after year and gotten pretty widespread media coverage of it with virtually no scrutiny whatsoever. So a few months before June of 2017, Broadbent Institute and Press Progress, its news agency, sat down together and said, what are we going to do about this, right? Broadbent Institute decided to commission a report by a couple of very smart economists who would dig through all of the research that Fraser Institute used and basically try to understand how they were coming up with this number. Well, it turns out they're coming up with this number because, one, they were somehow falsely assessing the average income of people to be much higher than it was. And two, on the tax side, they were including things like corporate taxes, oil royalties. They were throwing everything in the kitchen sink into that equation in ways that no tax economist would say was fair. And that's how they were coming out with these numbers. So Robert Shillington, who was the economist, wrote this really great report saying, actually, the rate of tax that they're claiming, it's about half of that, or maybe even less. At the same time, Press Progress went and did its own research. It looked at all the coverage over the last few years and looked to see whether or not the media had done their job. Had they fact-checked anything? Had they called an independent expert? Had they repeated verbatim what was in the press release? And we came out with our own report, which you see some numbers right there, about how the media had done a horrible job in covering the Fraser Institute report in a critical way. And we actually wrote a letter to the media, an open letter to the media, asking them to this year scrutinize Tax Freedom Day. In fact, what happened in 2017 is Tax Freedom Day's coverage went down to basically nil. And now only about one media outlet reports on Tax Freedom Day, and that's the Sun. So that's where we disrupted a bad cycle that was happening in our news information. And I think that's important to mark because we continue to try to do that. The last part I'm going to talk about before we get into the realm of digital media today is elections. So there's some other big nasties out there that we deal with, and those are often political leaders on the conservative side, and more, we do like some conservatives. There are some conservatives out there that we like, but boy, there are not a lot of them in power right now. Unfortunately, the day of the red Tory seems to be gone. We're seeing conservatives that more and more are a sort of populist version of conservatism. And we like populism. I quite like populism. I think there's a lot to be said for popular movements and how populism has grown. And I think there's a great discussion to be had about what is a progressive form of populism, the kind of populism we're seeing around Bernie Sanders, the kind of populism we're seeing around Jeremy Corbyn and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. All of that is populism too, frankly. That's a side note. But the populism that we're seeing around right populism tends to mean that we have these leaders that believe in whatever will make them popular with people who are joining them oftentimes out of great fear for what's happening in their lives. Because there's a lot of people scared right now. The world is a pretty precarious place. It feels unstable globally. It feels unstable sometimes in our communities and in our lives. A lot of people aren't getting by. Wages are stagnating. There's whole demographic groups that are just falling in Canada and in the US too. And so there's a reason why this is being driven. But these conservative populist leaders, I have to say, feel to me a little bit like carpetbaggers, right? Where they're kind of selling some version of snake oil, and it's our job to sort of make sure that, again, that fact check happens. And the best time to do this is elections, for two reasons, because, they're saying all sorts of stuff during elections, leading up to elections, that you can, go look at whether or not that's really true. They always have some candidates that are shooting off their mouth and making some bozo remark, or on some rant, or have some deep, dark past that they don't want discovered. And it's also the time when the media has the hardest time scrutinizing what they're saying, because the media, the general, like the major news organizations are just running to keep up. They're just publishing so fast that some of them have gotten better at doing fact checks, but for the most part, the day-to-day news, they're just putting the announcements out there, right? So I want to talk about Doug Ford for a second. We covered, of course, the Ontario election, and we covered it from a number of angles. We covered it, of course, from the kinds of things he would say, or the kinds of things he wouldn't say. His social conservatism and his ties with social conservatives like Charles McVety. Here's a story that actually did very, very well. It was one of our most popular stories, where he said he'd roll back certain laws protecting women's rights. We did stories, of course, on education and his potential cuts to education. We did stories on his allegiances in back rooms with groups like real estate developers who wanted to open up the Greenbelt for development, or Merit, who wanted to attack union rights. And we also did stories on some of his candidates who had said and done horrible things. And in fact, one of his candidates, you may have heard me mention earlier, was Andrew Lawton, an old Rebel Media host, who had a long and an ugly record of saying Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, racist, bigoted comments, and was trying to deny them all. Was basically claiming that he had mental health issues, except his time periods didn't quite match up. He may have had mental health issues, and no one's going to, certainly we are not going to question that so much, but we questioned whether or not he could claim all of his discretions or indiscretions based on that fact. And we exposed him in that period of time. And that was our job. Our job was to expose the policy elements of what Doug Ford was saying, of which there weren't many because he'd never really released a platform, to expose the connections he had with groups that were proposing things that most Ontarians did not want, and to expose some of his candidates. And what we found is that people really wanted that information. What you see on the left of the screen is what were the most shared news stories during on the Ontario election. Well, in the midst of CBC and National Post and the Star and Globe and Mail, we were often the most shared because people are thirsting for this information. It's important for us to provide it. Let's fast forward to the next election, which is Alberta with Jason Kenney, one of our favorites. And this is an example of where it's really important for us to start looking at what's happening in elections before the election starts. Because what was happening in Alberta before the election started were discoveries of alleged voter fraud and leadership election fraud that we started discovering and breaking in the news in January of that year, a full 3 or 4 months before the election actually went underway. There was a tape that we verified and broke a story on of 2 operatives talking about how they had set up Jeffrey Callaway, who was a leadership candidate for the UCP, to run in the UCP specifically to take down Kenney's main rival, Brian Jean. That was his only role. And since then, there have actually been UCP operatives and staffers close to Kenney that have been fined for this infraction. So the story we broke actually led to tens of thousands of dollars of fines. Another story that's still underway, that's still under RCMP investigation, is a story of alleged voter fraud during the leadership election. So let's just take a step back here and a little bit of reality check. This guy, who's now the premier of Alberta and is probably the most popular conservative premier in Canada, likely became leader of his party via fraud. That's what's being investigated right now. Now that's worth covering. We think that's worth covering. And so we were part of what made that not just news on our site, but broke it in such a way that other news agencies started to cover it. And we think that's important. But that's not the only thing we covered. I mean, you can see that some of the stuff that people shared most of our news articles were things like his plan to drive down wages and gut holiday pay. Now, it's not just the salacious stuff that people want. People also want real content. They want to know what's going to happen, what these people are proposing, and how it's going to impact their life. They want to know whether or not that person's going to help them make a living that's going to support their family or not. And so we see that stuff get shared as well. Last one. I mixed up my slides. Can you go one slide forward? There we go. So this election's no different. We're continuing to cover many aspects of this election. We covered within the first days of the election, we covered a candidate, I can't remember his name, Ogilvy in Winnipeg, who, as we broke a story about him having an Islamophobic website, anti-immigrant website, he actually resigned. He resigned about 15 minutes before we broke the story because he knew we were breaking the story. And we continue to cover both what Kenny says and what he doesn't say, and we'll continue to do that throughout the election. So please keep looking at our coverage during the election. And now we'll go to the other slide. Back. And where does this put us? Well, this puts us in pretty good standing for, four rabble-rousers in a room who get on the phone every morning at 8:30 and go, what are we covering today? I don't know, what do you see in the news? Oh, I found this thing on Twitter, right? We sit pretty well. We've got 145,000 Facebook followers, and so the Star has 472. Oh well, we're getting there. But it puts us in pretty good stead for the size of the operation we are and the budget that we have. However, the landscape is changing drastically. Now we go two ahead. We're really seeing the rise of right-wing social media. And they've done an amazing job at setting up a network of Facebook groups, and this is mostly on Facebook. What's really interesting is they aren't operating on a lot of, and there's some stuff happening on Reddit and some of those other places, but their main place of operation is Facebook, and they have set up a massive echo chamber. Now, Ontario Proud is one of the best known and most popular of these groups, and sort of tends to be a bit of the cog in the wheel. It's a creation of Jeff Ballingall. It was created in 2016, largely to go after wind at the time, around hydro rates. It has now evolved, has over 400,000 followers, produces just gads of content. I mean, it's amazing what they put out there. They're pumping, a dozen, 20, 30 memes and shareables on a daily basis. So tons and tons and tons of content. And the tone of it, frankly, is really, really nasty. I don't like some of the people that they don't like, but I don't think that you need to be as personal as their attacks are. And their attacks are incredibly personal. They tend to drive content, conservative content, not based on actually having any particular ideology or conservative ideology, but looking for what upsets and pisses people off most. So they'll wander right into dog whistling around anti-immigration. They'll wander right into messages that start to edge on being racist. They'll wander into homophobic messaging. They certainly did around WIN. They have other sites that just pump out memes, all sorts of memes. Sometimes it's like memes like, look, Niagara Falls. Do you like Niagara Falls? Share. right? And then next thing you know, you're now caught in their network because you shared the thing that you liked about Niagara Falls. Or my favorite is Miss Vicky's Chips, made in Canada. If you're proud of that, share, right? So then you share that, and now you're caught in their network. These guys, are getting to a point where they're reaching up to 1.6 million Canadians on a regular basis in their work. Now, let me just step back for a second here. For those of you who think that Facebook is a dying social media platform, let me tell you something. When we started on Facebook in 2013, there were 18 million Canadian users. There are now 24 million Canadian users. It has not gone down. It has gone up. What has changed is who's on Facebook. And there's a set of folks who are under 30 who never went there in the first place. They just bypassed completely. And they went to other platforms. That being said, Facebook is still a huge platform and the largest platform on social media in Canada. And so what's happening right now is these guys, they're beating us in content by about 4-1. When I say us, I mean not just Press Progress, but like the social progressive movement in general. They're beating us on content about 4-1. So why I bring this up is to say to you that they don't have to beat us. They got a lot of money. They invested at least $1 million that we know of, and probably a lot more that we don't know about, within the first couple of years to get those followers up to 400,000 to produce that content and pump it out. And they're probably just bringing in more money to push more. But what we have are networks and organizations that can achieve, in a sense, what they've achieved by ensuring that we strategically produce and share content amongst ourselves. What Press Progress is doing more and more is when we write one story, we're trying to get into the pattern of producing 3 or 4 products off of it. One graphic, one shareable, one quote, maybe a video, so that we just have more content. Because sometimes this is just a content game. We just have to push the content. What we need, our allies and friends and organizations and partners to do is to share. Share the content, share it with your networks, share it on any platform that you have, because that's how we'll beat these guys. Click for. And there's a lot of big nasties out there that we gotta make sure that we expose and counter and fact check and ensure that they aren't able to put out their message without having a progressive counterpoint. And I'll end there. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Katrina. Is there any questions on the floor? Sonny.
I guess I just wonder, do you have any counter to the strategies that are used by the right, like the Cambridge Analytica type of organizations that really, use data from Facebook or else to sort of hyper-target messages to people in swing states or swing voters? If anyone there's a really great documentary on Netflix about it. It's called The Great Hack, and it really talks about how Cambridge Analytica really manipulates the system by targeting these voters. And I just wonder if you have any counter to that or any strategy for dealing with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things going on with that. I mean, the platforms are changing to respond to some of the abuses that existed in that. And they change their algorithms from time to time. And so the best counter strategy is actually to be able to keep on top of how the algorithms are now working, to understand what your content that you produce can best take advantage of those algorithms. But we do, in fact, and we have started in the last 8 months, doing audience research specifically to hyper-target. But our hyper-targeting is different. We're not interested in finding, someone's fear point and pressing that button, which is what Cambridge Analytica did, right? They found what people were scared of and then drove that fear either to get them not to vote or to get them to fall a certain way. What we want to do is actually look at how people are engaged in our content and how they're going to engage more in these issues. So we're interested in figuring out whether or not they're interested in social justice, whether or not education is important to them, whether or not good wages is important to them, and then targeting stories that are of interest to them so that we can get the kind of information they want in their hands. That's what we're choosing to use. So we're choosing, in our minds, an ethical version of what they're doing. Because frankly, there's some practices of theirs that we really don't want to copy.
Mike?
So, for the folks in the room, what are some of the best ways that they can, because I'm sure a lot of what you said, if not all of what you said, is right down their alley. What are some of the best ways, things that they can do with their busy schedule, just like everybody else, that they can help move their agenda with respect to social media or even beyond social media maybe? Yeah.
So let's talk social media first, because that's the obvious platform. Pick 2 or 3 content generators that you like on social media. They're progressive content generators. Pick 2 or 3. Start small, and share their content with your friends. There is no more powerful way to operate on social media. The most trusted content on social media is content that has been shared by a friend in your timeline. That's the moment in which people find information to be credible. So, and in a world where everyone is starting to, second guess what they see on social media, it's that much more important. So that's the first thing. Pick 2 or 3 content developers or content pushers and share their stuff. The second thing would be ensure that when you're talking one-on-one with people, that you're using what you liked from some of that content and some of those messages to be part of what you say. Oops, sorry. To be part of what you say to people. Social media is good at some types of persuasion, but it cannot be a one-on-one conversation. And we can't stop having one-on-one conversations. We have to have them. We have to have one-on-one conversations where we're willing to tell our own stories, our own personal stories. Facts and figures only go so far. You gotta meet people at the heart. And so never think that sharing on social media is gonna do all the job for you. We still have to talk to each other.
Larry, thank you.
Yeah,
Larry Walker.
Question. I'm from British Columbia. My question is, how much control are the major news medias, like we have over there, we get the Province, the Vancouver Sun, and I'm just curious, I find the newspaper incredibly biased at times, and they seem to have a slant always the same way. I'm just wondering who controls the news coming out of those papers? Is it a small group, or when you come over to Ontario, is it a totally different, I guess you call them owners? Mm-hmm. Like, that's a huge amount of power you're giving somebody when they control that kind of information. Is it a group of people doing this, or is it just
it depends on the news organization, but overall what we've seen in news media over the last 10, 15 years is a ton of amalgamations and mergers, which means there's fewer owners. And there's much more centralized control of the message and what bent, what bias these news operations are coming forward with. So, in Ontario and nationally, I think, there's 5 different stations. Let's take CBC out of it. 5 different stations that are owned by 2 companies, right? So that's what's happened to our news media. So you do have, with traditional news media, much less diverse reporting and biases operating, and much more tight, sort of top-down control. That being said, there are great reporters and editors out there. Every single journal, even the Sun. I know some great people who've come out of the Sun. Have some great reporters and editors, some great folks over at National Post too, who are very committed to doing good journalism. So, it's not that we shouldn't read these news publications. It's just that we need to read them with good scrutiny and understanding what those biases may be, I think. Does that answer your question?
Chris.
Chris Kenny from Winnipeg.
Excellent.
I'm kind of interested in how you target, there's the progressives. I know I can share something on Facebook, and I know Ron's going to hit like the people in this room, my friends in the room, they hit and then there's the middle people. But what is your strategy in targeting the people that Ontario Proud speaks to, the other side? How do you target them? How should we target them, or do we just give up?
No, we absolutely, because what's interesting about Ontario Proud is that, Ontario Proud actually, part of its audience is an audience that is very open to a progressive populist message. They basically look at the economy, how it's working right now, and they think that's not working for me, right? They look at a bunch of elitists getting away with everything, and they say, why is that happening, right? Well, there's a progressive answer to that as well as a right-wing answer to that. And they're actually can be just as persuaded by that progressive answer. So it's about how we develop the content. It's about whether or not the content is written in a way that appeals to them, that starts to answer that feeling of like, you know what, some people are getting everything, and the rest of us aren't getting much of anything at all, and I want that to change. I don't like what impact that's happening on my life or my community. That's one way to do it. Another way is actually to just go directly target them. I can press a button on Facebook that says, I want my promotion, my money and my ad budget to go to targeting people who like Ontario Proud. You can go directly in and send them your content and see if they bite. And we need to be talking to people who are outside of our little circle, because if we don't, our circle's just going to get smaller and smaller.
Any other questions? Bill? Anybody over here?
Well, how effective is going in and saying, Facebook, this is offensive to me?
I don't know. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that because I find sometimes the way that Facebook reacts to stuff kind of baffling. You have to remember that a lot of what Facebook does to curate or screen the content is done mechanically. Like, it's done by computers, it's done by algorithms. It's hard to get a live person to look at it, and when you do get a live person to look at it, then you're dealing with their subjective judgment, right? And that's, in Facebook, in defense of Facebook, they deal with a lot of content, right? So that's a lot of screening. It's kind of impossible to do that without having computer programs run some of it. But it does mean that sometimes it's hard to get attention paid when something is offensive if it's not offensive in ways that the computer program picks up. It also means the content that isn't actually offensive gets pulled off of Facebook. Like there is a famous story about women promoting breastfeeding getting pulled off of Facebook because there was an exposed nipple in the shot. And it was, is seen as lewd. So it's really an imperfect system.
And as a quick follow-up, so then how do you work against that echo chamber?
Well, I think it's a constant challenge. We're constantly having to update how we produce content, and we are, quite frankly, behind these guys because we're focused on telling real stories and not just producing memes, right? So their ability to game the system is ahead of ours. I'll be totally honest about that. And that's because of where our priority has been. It's been on good journalistic reporting. So, there's good reason for that. But we do need to get better at that. And the thing is, the platform changes all the time. The algorithms are changing all the time. So there's two things. We got to stay ahead or on top of how the platform is changing. But we also have to make sure that we don't just depend on this platform. Because Facebook, we've seen the troubles that Facebook has undergone over the last 2 or 3 years and the scandal that's been embroiled in. And it means that it is vulnerable to all sorts of things happening to it over the next period of time. And we don't know what's going to happen to Facebook, right? And as you just pointed out, we don't control Facebook. So we got to make sure that we're not just pumping content through Facebook. We're using other social media sites, but we're also using our own website. We're using our friends and partners via email lists. other sorts of forms to get our content out so that if for some reason, stuff goes goofy with Facebook, we're not stuck.
Sunny, and one other question. Will be the last question. Sunny?
I guess I just wanted to address the brother's question over there about, are there a group of people who are shaping media opinion? And I would say, yes, they're called capitalists, right? They're the owners, right? Who owns the Washington Post? Jeff Bezos, right? Is he going to endorse Bernie Sanders, who's calling for socialism and outlawing billionaires? No, I don't think he is, right? I'd also say I think we're kind of losing this right now, in the sense that Ontario Proud, I just looked, they have 450,000 subscribers, right? So way more than Press Progress. And they were hugely influential in the Ontario election. That's one of the reasons why we have Doug Ford right now. So I think as Labour leaders, it's incumbent upon us to use some of our political capital with our members to spread, Labour-friendly messages, because it really does make a difference. I think at USA, we had for the first time ever, we had a sort of political day of action where we commemorated the first 100 days of Doug Ford being in office, and we started a dialogue with our members. And I think it was really positive. We got a really good turnout, and I just encourage other people to do that as well. I know even working at a university, we do have people who support conservatives, but I think you need to talk to those people and tell them, this is really hurting you, and this is why. Look, they've capped us at 1% wage increase. This is because of the way you voted, and you need to address that.
I think that was an answer.
Here.
Will.
Well, Christine, you're lucky to have 1%.
Yeah.
Here's that too.
Will Christie, ACs. So playing devil's advocate, how will I counter the narrative that you are basically just a counterpoint to Rebel Media? You're just a leftist socialist that's propagating untrue stories to undermine and wreck our economy and steal jobs and other. I like you guys. I share your stuff. You have a truthiness that appeals to me. But how do I sell you to people that aren't going to buy that?
Well, I mean, there's two parts to that. This comes to the head versus heart aspect of any time you're trying to persuade anyone of anything, which is, there's the facts. Our stories are fact-checked. Our stories are proper journalism. And one of the things that gives us credibility is our stories are used and picked up by other journalistic sites. Rebel Media is not. But ultimately, it's about whether or not what we're saying sort of resonates with people. That's really what it comes down to. Does it resonate? Does it feel true to you? Does this align with some of the experiences or things you've heard in your life? That's actually how I convince most people. And if you're questioning it, tell me what you think is wrong with this, and let me present you with the facts that I know. But it's at the heart first, right? Does this resonate? Is this something that you're worried about too? Are you concerned about the level of inequality in Canada? Are you concerned about the fact that people's jobs are stagnating? Are you worried about the fact that post-secondary education is becoming harder and harder for people to afford, and when they get out of school, it's really hard to find a good job in the field they just studied in? Are these things that worry you? Well, let's talk a little bit about what that's about. I think that's where it starts. And then you get into the facts, and then you can debate all that sort of stuff. But it really starts with what people are thinking and worried about and wanting in their lives. Do we want to be able to have a healthcare system where everyone's medications are provided so that no one has to scrimp on their heart medication because they're worried about paying their heating bill? That happens right now in Canada. That shouldn't happen in Canada. We're way too wealthy for that to be happening in Canada. That's where I start.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Katrina. And on behalf of all of us, we have a little gift for you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. This is very interesting, and we appreciate all the work you do on behalf of us. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it.
We enjoyed it.